And I have to tell you, I think as many of you know, my path to this microphone here today was a bit of a bumpy ride. And I have to say the support for having me here that came forth was both extraordinarily heartwarming and humbling and one of the most moving experiences of my life. So thank you very much. It is an extraordinary pleasure to be here. My new book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, really does look at a big, profound question. And the question is, in a very big picture way, is our paradigm of care that we have embraced in this country, which puts continual medication use at the cornerstone of that care, is it really working? That's the question. Is it working for us as a society? Is it helping people get better and stay well? Is it improving outcomes in the aggregate or not? And that really ultimately is sort of a scientific question, and you can go to the scientific literature to try to answer it. Now, the one caveat I would say is, as you approach that story, it doesn't mean that you're going to say that medications don't have a place in psychiatry, or medications don't have a place in treatment. I think everyone would agree there can be a place for medications. The question really, as you begin that research, is what is the best place for them? And what is the proper place for them? And that's really the intent of this whole exercise. And I do think it's a profound one because, as Leah referred to, instead of seeing sort of the problem of mental disorders abate in our society, we're seeing it grow in our society. And I'll get to the disability numbers in a second. But that's really the question, is if we're seeing disability numbers grow, we might want to take stock and say, well, what could we do different? How could we get better outcomes? That sort of thing. And so that's the focus of this book. And I would like, I'm a journalist, so I approach this from the outside. And what I sort of do in the book, and what I'd like everyone here today to do is, just for a moment, put aside your own personal thoughts about medications and just join me as a journalist. Think about this as a journalist and how, if you were a journalist, you would go about investigating this question, because it's really an outsider's point of view, okay? But it is meant to be this sort of objective, investigative, what does the science say, etc. Now, I will tell you, I've really been working on this in a sense for about 10 years, because I did Mad in America, which was my introduction to this field. I will tell you that I began as a complete believer in the common wisdom that these drugs fix chemical imbalances in the brain, people with schizophrenia needed to be on the drugs for life, and in fact in the Boston Globe series, one of the things we wrote about as an abuse were studies where patients had been withdrawn from medications. And so we said, well, why would you ever do that if these were drugs like insulin for diabetes? You would never withdraw insulin from a diabetic. And so what I'm telling you is I began as a journalist from the common belief system, the common wisdom. What's your next step as a journalist? Well, the next step, what you do is you talk to people who have a psychiatric diagnosis and have experience with the medications. And it's just the classic thing you go out there. Now, I've probably had the honor and privilege of having spoken to well over 100 people who've told me their stories. And I will tell you, when you do that, it's a very mixed bag. You hear people that tell you the medications have really been wonderful for them and really have been life-saving. You hear people that will tell you stories about how problematic the medications are and how they work for a while and then they don't work and they're dealing with the side effects. You'll hear people who tell you that they feel that the medications have worsened their long-term course. And then you'll hear people who have gotten off the medications and done quite well. So it's really, from the anecdotal point of view, it's a complex picture. And you see these varying responses, and what that complex picture doesn't do for you as a journalist is fit neatly into this idea that all people need to be on medications all their lives. So right away you start seeing that maybe there's some nuances in terms of medication use. Now, let's just look at some questions that in essence we can start to answer from a journalistic point of view. Is this paradigm of care working for us as a society which focuses on continual medication use? And one way I investigated in this book is to look at the disability numbers, because if it's working well, we should see, if anything, a decrease in the disability rates, right? That's usually what happens when you have effective medical treatment. So what I did is I went back to 1955 And the reason I picked 1955, that's the year Thorazine comes into asylum medicine. The common wisdom is that Thorazine ushered in a psychopharmacological revolution, a great leap forward. You can read in conventional histories of psychiatry that the introduction of Thorazine was as profound a medical leap forward as the introduction of penicillin in infectious medicine. So that is part of the sense that there has been this great leap forward. And it's said to be the first drug that is a specific agent to a psychiatric disorder. So what was the disability rate in 1955? Well, basically, people under government care were in state and county mental hospitals. You find that there were 560,000 people in state and county mental hospitals at that time. However, if you dig into the data a bit, you find that there were only about 360,000 people with psychiatric diagnoses. And that's a disability rate of about 1 in every 484 people. Now, as you all know, as a society, we basically decided to deinstitutionalize after that. And the way that other researchers have tracked, quote, the disabled mentally ill, by that they mean people with psychiatric diagnoses that are under government care, receiving some sort of government care, is they now get SSI or SSDI. So what other researchers have done to track this rate is then to follow the SSI and SSDI numbers from, say, 1987 forward. Now, 1987 is a great year to look at because that's the year we get Prozac. Okay, that's the first of the second generation drugs that are said to be better than the first. So we get SSRIs, said to be better than the tricyclics. Then we get the atypical antipsychotics, said to be better than the old standard neuroleptics. And we are told that is another leap forward in better medical care. And by the way, since Prozac, we really have embraced this drug-based paradigm of care. Societal spending on psychiatric drugs rose from around $800 million in 1987 to more than $40 billion today. So this extraordinary increase. Now, what happened to the SSI and SSDI numbers? In 1987, there were 1.25 million people on SSI and SSDI due to a mental disorder. So that's up from around 360,000 in 1955, and it's a disability rate of roughly 1 in 184. That's more than a doubling of the disability rate. Now, if we go forward from 1987 to today, we're still at least measuring just SSI and SSDI numbers. We have the same metric, so it's a good metric. Whereas you might say that moving from the hospitalized and mentally ill to SSI and SSDI numbers, it's a little bit of an apples and oranges comparison. Now we've got the oranges to oranges. What's happened since then? We are now, the number of people on SSI and SSDI has more than tripled. It's now more than 4 million people. That's a disability rate of around 1 in 76. Now there's a couple things when you see these numbers. One thing is, that tells you that this paradigm of care is not working for us as a society. Because obviously as a society what we need is people to work, to live full lives, and not to be on disability. I mean, that's really the societal need and goal. That's number one. And number two, it's not sustainable. We can't keep going down this path. The number of people going on disability, adults per day, between ages 18 and 65, is 850 people per day, 365 days a year. That's how many new people are going on. Look around you. I think, what do we have here? 1,000 people in this room, roughly? That's how many people roughly are going on disability every day in the United States due to a psychiatric disorder. We just can't keep going down this path. Now the total numbers obviously don't increase by that much because you have people aging out and frankly you have people dying as well, and a small number of people going back to work. Now that's the story about adults. What's happening with kids? As you know, we've really embraced the use of medications with kids since the arrival of Prozac. In 1987, there were 16,200 children on disability receiving an SSI payment due to a psychiatric disorder. Today, there are more than 600,000. It's a 35-fold increase. There are 250 children going on disability on SSI. In other words, they receive this every day now in the United States. And if you follow those children forward, when they hit 18, what's happening to them? They're going right on to adult disability. So what you see forming in our society really is this pathway where you diagnose kids, you medicate kids, and you are setting many of those kids onto a lifelong path as, quote, a mental patient. And if you look at the amount of money that government is going to spend for that child who lives age 18 and goes on disability and is going to spend his life on disability, it will easily exceed $1 million. The point of all this is, if you just look at the disability numbers say that we as a society need to do something different. And we need to go down a different path. So the second thing now that you will do if you're a journalist is now you'll start to try to deconstruct the common wisdom, and you'll just look to see if things that are said about psychiatric disorders and said about the medications say that they fix chemical imbalances in the brain, you will ask, is that true? And the reason you want to ask is that true? Because if it is true, that indeed is a model for a great medical advance forward. If you look at the great medical leaps forward, we usually understand the pathology of a disorder, and then you develop a treatment that's an antidote, or in some way, in fact, is specific to that disorder. That's generally where you see great leaps of medical leaps forward. And the common wisdom is, in the sense that has happened in psychiatry. We have found that people with psychiatric disorders have chemical imbalances, and the drugs help fix those imbalances. But is it true? And this is, I think, a profound question, because if you're going to figure out how to use the medications, you want to know if that's true or not. Now, real quickly, if you investigate that, where did the chemical imbalance theory of mental disorders arise, and when did it arise? It arose in the 1960s, really. It has two legs. One is that schizophrenia is caused by too much dopamine activity, and the other is that depression is caused, in essence, by low serotonin. But where did it arise? It arose from understanding how the drugs acted on the brain and not by investigations into the patients. So, for example, they came to understand that antipsychotics blocked dopamine receptors in the brain. And a real quick biological lesson. How do neurons in the brain communicate? You have a presynaptic neuron that releases the molecule into the synaptic gap, say dopamine. And that dopamine then binds with receptors on the receiving neuron, which is known as the postsynaptic neuron. So what do antipsychotics do, Thorazine? They block about 70% of the dopamine receptors. So researchers said, aha, if the drugs block dopamine receptors and they're effective, maybe people with schizophrenia have too much dopamine activity in the brain. That's how the dopamine hypothesis arose. Same with the low serotonin theory of depression, in essence. They came to understand that antidepressants, what do? They block the normal reuptake of serotonin from that synaptic cleft. Now, again, a little bit of biology. You have the neurotransmitter that goes into that synaptic cleft. The brain has to remove that messenger in order to terminate the message. That's the normal function. So what a Prozac does, it blocks the normal reuptake. The serotonin stays longer in the synaptic cleft. So people reason, aha, we're upping serotonergic activity, and if that's an antidepressant, perhaps people with depression have low amounts of serotonin. Well, basically in the 1970s and 1980s, they then investigated, do people with schizophrenia prior to being medicated have overactive dopamine systems? And it's a little complicated how they do that, and I won't bore you with the details, but they did not find that to be so. And so, for example, if you follow this research forward, Steve Hyman, who's a former director of the NIMH, he's a neuroscientist, he's currently provost of Harvard University. He writes in 2002 in his book, Molecular Neuropharmacology, quote, "There is no compelling evidence that a lesion in the dopamine system is a primary cause of schizophrenia." So they did not find that, okay?